Howdy, 5th graders. The objective of today's video is I can determine the volume of a rectangular prism in problems related to the number of layers and the number of unit cubes in the base. Let's get started. Today we're going to do an activity called layers upon layers. You're going to need grid paper, and if you have any, some little unit cubes or some sort of square blocks if you have those at home. Let's look at our activity. The first step says, draw a rectangle of any size on the grid provided below and shade the squares that are inside the rectangle. Well, for today's activity, let's all do the same rectangle so that way we're talking about the same numbers. So we're going to do a rectangle that is 2 squares that way, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 squares going this direction. So we're going to draw our rectangle, and we're going to shade in. Okay, so the next question says, what is the area of the rectangle? Well, we're not sure how to do area. Let's come back to our handy-dandy reference chart. And if I'm going to look at area of a rectangle, I know that my formula is going to be area equals length times width. Be careful and make sure you know that that's an L, not a 1. Or area is equal to base times height. Well, we're pretty familiar with the length times width, so we're going to use that for our formula for area. So area is going to equal length times width. And I'd make my L as a cursive L so that way I don't think it's a 1. Well, let's look at what our length is. My rectangle is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 squares long. And how wide is my rectangle? 1, 2. My rectangle is 2 squares wide. So, if I want to find the area of my rectangle, my area is going to equal length times width. So I'm going to plug in the numbers that I know. So the area is equal to 6 times 2. Well, what is 6 times 2? That's right. It's 12. So the area of my rectangle is 12. That's pretty easy. Not too tough so far. Let's come down to the next number. Number 3. How many centimeter cubes are needed to cover the shaded region? And how does this compare to the area of the shaded region? Okay, well, let's use our centimeter cubes. And I'm going to cover those squares. Centimeter cubes are nice because they fit right there on those squares. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Okay, so it took me 12 centimeter cubes. To cover the region that I shaded in, to cover the area of my rectangle. How does this compare to the area of the shaded region? Well, my area was 12, so basically if I put 1 cube on top of each square in my area, the number of cubes is equal to the area of the base. Or the area of the rectangle. Now, how many layers of cubes do I have on my base right now, on my rectangle? I have one, right? I only have one layer of cubes. So my one layer of cubes is equal to 12 cubes. So one layer equals 12. Now, stack another layer of cubes onto the first layer. After stacking this layer, what is the height of the model? Okay, here we go again. I'm going to stack another layer of cubes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Okay, so now, what is the height of our model? Right now, we have 2 layers. And how many total cubes are in the 2 layers? Well, I had 12 on the bottom, and I have 12 on the top, so I have 2 sets of 12, or 12 times 2, because remember it took me 12 to cover the first layer. So 12 times 2 equals 24 cubes. Okay, now how many cubes would you need if you had 3 layers? Okay, well let's add some more. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. Okay, so I just added 12 more cubes, so I have one set of cubes that look wooden, a second set of cubes that look blue, and a third set of cubes that look white. How many cubes are in each of my sets? That's right, there's 12. So there's 12 wooden, 12 blue, and 12 white. So that's 3 sets of 12 cubes. So 3 sets of 12 cubes is 12 times 3, or 36. Okay, now, what would happen if I had 5 layers? Well, I'm going to run out of cubes here in a minute, so let me see if I can find a pattern. One layer of cubes was 12, which was the same as my area. 2 sets of cubes was 24, so 2 layers of cubes was 2 sets, or 24. 3 layers of cubes was 3 sets of 12, or 36. So 5 layers of cubes is going to be 5 sets of 12 cubes, or 12 times 5, because there are 12 cubes in each layer, and I'm going to have 5 layers. So 12 times 5, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, 45, 50, 55, 60. That's going to be 60 cubes. Well, what if I had 7 layers? Okay, well, I'm starting to see a pattern here. Each layer is going to have 12 cubes. So if I had 7 layers, that's 7 sets of 12. Well, 7 times 10 is 70. And then 2 more 7s would be 14 more. So 70 and 14, yep, that's going to be 84. So it would take me 84 cubes. Now, let's look at the bottom. It talks about explain how this activity represents the formula V equals capital BH. What represents the B and the H and the V? Well, let's come back to our formula chart. In our formula chart, it talks about, I'm going to use a different color, volume of a rectangular prism, and we have this formula right here. Volume equals base times height. The big B stands for not one measurement, like notice the length and the width and the height are all lowercase. The B over here is capital because it stands for the area of the base, which that involves an operation. That's not just one measurement. So B equals the area of the base, which remember how we found area? That's right, we did length times width. So area of the base is the same thing as length times width. H equals the height, which what did we call our height in our activity? What did we keep adding in our activity? That's right. That was our number of layers. Because remember, we started, if all I did was shade in those 12 squares, how many layers of cubes did we have? We didn't have any. That's right. It's a rectangle that's shaded in, finding the area, that's flat on the paper. So there's not a single layer there. That's 0 layers. So there is no volume because it's flat on the paper. But as soon as we added our first row of cubes, now we have 1 layer. So our height was 1. When I started to add my second layer, I had 2 layers of cubes. So my height was 2. When I added my third layer of cubes, my height was 3. So the height is just the number of layers in our rectangular prism. So V represents the volume. And the volume is the number of total cubes. That's what we were finding with our questions here. When it says how many total cubes are there in 2 layers, that was my volume. So 24 cubes was my volume. Here in 3 layers, 36 cubes is my volume. 60 cubes is my volume, and 84 cubes is my volume. So volume is equal to the area of the base, which could also be length times width, times the height. That's how we have 2 different formulas for volume, because one formula is big base, capital B, base times height, which is area of the base times height, and the other formula is length times width times height. But all the length times width is the area of the base. So depending on whether I know the area of the base or whether I'm given either a length or a width, I can use either formula because they represent the same thing.
on a test or in a problem. So it says Miss Powers is trying to fill this rectangular prism with centimeter cubes. If the rectangular prism holds 5 layers, what would be the volume of the figure? So I'm looking for the volume of a rectangular prism. So what I always like to do is go look at my star chart. And it says volume right here, rectangular prism. V equals length times width times height. So I'm going to write that down. V equals length times width times height. But it also had something next to it. It said, or volume equals BH. And I know when two things are touching each other, that means multiplication. So B stands for the base, like we just did up here, times the height. So we can solve these either way. We're going to show it with this way right now. So in order to find the volume, we need to find the length. So let's label this. We have 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So just looking right here at what I see, I know that our length is 5 and our width is 3. But we don't know our height yet. Well, I know here it says if the rectangular prism holds 5 layers, what would be the volume? So I know from back up here, our layers represented how high it was. So layers are going to take place for the H. So V equals 5 times 3 times 5 layers. So now I can just solve it. 5 times 3 I know is 15 times 5. So now I'm going to do 15 times 5. So the volume of this rectangular prism, if it had 5 layers stacked up with cubes, would be